Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving into what is honestly one of the most fascinating economic paradoxes of our modern era, Japan's technological plateau. For decades, Japan was the undisputed heavyweight champion of future tech. But when we look at the digital landscape today, there is a glaring, almost bizarre absence of Japanese companies at the very top of the software and internet food chain. It's a massive mystery, and it forces us to completely rethink how we actually define innovation. To really wrap our heads around this paradox, I want you to picture something for a second. Imagine you're sitting on a commuter train in Tokyo, and the year is 2000. Now, while the rest of the world was perfectly content playing Snake on heavy, brick-like phones that could literally double as blunt weapons, you are living in what feels like an absolute sci-fi future. You pull out this sleek, foldable mobile phone, you're checking emails on the go, snapping photos, recording videos. The technology seamlessly integrated into daily Japanese life over 2 decades ago was just breathtaking.
And look, this technological marvel wasn't just some sudden fluke, it was the realization of a global expectation. Back in the 1980s, the awe and honestly the fear of Japanese dominance was absolutely everywhere in Hollywood. Think of that famous scene from the 1985 movie Back to the Future, right? Marty McFly casually tells a completely shocked 1955 Doc Brown that all the best stuff is made in Japan. That was the global consensus. But then, fast forward to the reality of our world today. The biggest, most powerful tech giants, Apple, Google, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, NVIDIA, they are exclusively American.
Okay, let's dive into this. The core mystery we are unraveling today is simply this. Why didn't Japan produce a Google? Did a whole generation of brilliant Japanese engineers just suddenly fail? Did these powerhouse companies somehow forget how to innovate? Or did something much more fundamental happen behind the scenes? Is it possible the very rules of the global economic game completely changed while Japan was busy perfecting the old one?
Part 1. 1985. Japan is the future.
So, to find our answer, we really need to set the historical context and travel back to 1985. This was an era where the future quite literally had a Japanese name. If you wanted to see tomorrow, you looked at companies like Sony, Panasonic, Toshiba, Hitachi. Sony had just put music in our pockets with the Walkman. Panasonic was pioneering television tech. They weren't just manufacturing electronics, they were defining the future of consumer existence. Now, people love to throw around the cliche that this was all just because of hard work, but that completely misses the reality of the 1980s Japanese engine. As Ezra Vogel pointed out in his incredibly influential 1979 book, Japan is Number One, this was a brilliantly coordinated institutional system. You had the government, specifically the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, working in absolute lockstep with the private sector. Banks were handing out incredibly patient long-term financing. Companies were entirely focused on massive market share rather than quick short-term profits, using philosophies like Toyota's Kaizen, which is the practice of continuous incremental improvement. Basically, it was a machine perfectly designed to win at industrial capitalism.
Part 2. Is capitalism dead? But what happens when the very nature of capitalism evolves? Well, this brings us to the first major clue in our mystery, viewed through the lens of a highly debated yet incredibly fascinating modern economic theory. In his 2023 book, the Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis made a pretty deeply provocative claim. He stated, "We no longer live in the era of classic capitalism. The new era is techno-feudalism." Now, we're not taking this as absolute political truth today, but rather using it as a really useful analytical framework to understand a monumental shift in the market. How could capitalism be dead when we clearly still have factories, corporations, and stock markets everywhere?
And this comparison brilliantly illustrates his point. If we look at the two eras side by side, we see a fundamental, ground-up shift in the actual source of wealth. For 2 centuries under industrial capitalism, wealth came from owning the means of production, right? Factories, physical machines, tangible capital. But under what Varoufakis calls techno-feudalism, wealth actually comes from owning the digital infrastructure itself. It comes from platforms and extracting what he calls digital rent.
Part 3. Digital Landlords.
Let's expand on this medieval metaphor for a second, because it is incredibly striking. Back in the Middle Ages, feudal lords owned the physical land, and peasants had to pay them a portion of their crops just to be allowed to work it. Today, Varoufakis argues, platform giants are essentially the new feudal lords. They are our digital landlords. Think about Amazon, Apple, or Google. Amazon isn't just a store selling you products. It's an entire marketplace that millions of independent sellers must pay to access if they want to reach customers. Apple doesn't just sell you a cool piece of glass and metal. They control the App Store, forcing developers to pass through their toll gates and pay a commission, a digital rent, just to reach users. Google controls your actual visibility on the internet. They don't just participate in the market, they literally are the market.
Part 4. Galapagos Syndrome.
So if the global game completely shifted from making physical products to owning digital platforms, why didn't Japan just make the leap? Well, this brings us to our second major clue, and it relies on this fascinating biological metaphor that gets applied directly to technological evolution. In the tech world, they call this the Galapagos syndrome. Think of Charles Darwin's famous isolated islands, right? Species there evolved perfectly to survive in their very specific, closed environment, but they were completely alien to the rest of the world. And that is exactly what happened to Japanese technology. They developed these incredible, wildly futuristic technologies, but they were so perfectly hyper-adapted to the Japanese domestic market that they completely failed to become globally compatible standards.
Let's trace this on a timeline, because it really builds the picture. In 1999, we're talking years before the smartphone revolution as we know it today, the Japanese telecom company NTT Docomo launched iMode. Guys, they practically invented the mobile web. Japanese users were doing mobile banking, checking train schedules, and shopping online 25 years ago. It was incredible, but it never really left Japan. Then, in 2007, Apple launched the iPhone. And the thing is, Apple didn't just invent a better phone. They built a massive global ecosystem with the App Store.
Part 5. The network effect.
Apple's massive success reveals the invisible engine of this whole new economy. It's the engine that ultimately decided the winner of the global tech race, totally superseding sheer hardware quality. So the crucial point here is understanding this compounding loop, famously known as the network effect. Step 1, more users join a platform. Step 2, because there are tons of users, developers flock there to build apps. Step 3, with more apps, the ecosystem becomes totally essential to everyday life, which of course attracts even more users. And finally, step 4, the platform owner extracts immense digital rent from this entire ecosystem. In the digital age, scale and ecosystem are infinitely more valuable than having the best raw hardware.
Which creates this stark, undeniable contrast between two entirely different playbooks. The Japanese model continued to focus relentlessly on producing the world's absolute best hardware. They continued to win the old game of physical engineering. Meanwhile, the American model completely shifted to building the world's largest digital networks. The Americans basically capitalized on the entirely new game of digital platform economics.
Part 6. Rules of the new game.
And here is the absolute tragic irony of our whole story. The very institutions that made Japan an unstoppable industrial giant in the 1980s, they are exactly what held them back in the digital era. The rules of this new game require a totally different setup. The platform economy demands highly aggressive venture capital, an intense laser focus on software rather than just hardware, immediate global scaling, lightning-fast decision-making, artificial intelligence, and above all else, platform ownership. Japan's system of cautious long-term bank financing, their slow corporate hierarchies, and that meticulous incremental hardware improvement, the famous Kaizen we talked about, it was simply too slow and too rigid for the explosive, software-driven world of platform economics.
Which leaves us with a really vital realization to take away from our deep dive today. Especially for those of us watching from Turkey or frankly any nation out there currently striving to build a modern economy, we have to ask ourselves a pretty provocative question. Is our real goal merely producing high technology, like just building the best physical gadgets and hardware? Or in a world of techno-feudalism, is true technological advancement actually about building the digital platforms that everyone else's technology is forced to run on? It's a massive fundamental shift in perspective, and one we simply can't afford to ignore. Thanks so much for joining me for today's analysis, and I'll see you next time.